I'm sure you've had a situation where you were caught off guard by something that happened or by something that somebody said to you. And you found yourself in that moment off balance. And rather than respond to what happened, you found yourself reacting in the moment. So it's when you find yourself very often coming up against somebody who you find it just difficult to like. Someone who makes your life difficult. And so you find yourself wanting to respond in like kind and make their lives difficult. And it's difficult, and it's not easy to not be unkind to unkind people. It's difficult not to be mean back to mean people. It's difficult to be sensitive to insensitive people. One wants to respond by doing unto others as they are doing unto you. So what do you do when you bump up against somebody who is either unkind or simply mean? Do you just ignore them? But doesn't that just empower them to continue in the same way? Do you push back in like kind? Well, then you become like the very person you don't want to be like. Well, in the portion of scripture we're going to look at today, we are given an option where we don't have to ignore the person and you don't have to become like them. We're going to look at another option that takes away some of their power and actually positions us to keep our frustrations from overflowing and making the situation even worse. Jesus taught it and Jesus modeled it. In fact, Jesus was the ultimate model of this. But today we're going to look at a character in the Old Testament by the name of Abigail, who also models this characteristic. Now, Abigail is a character we encounter that in part of David's story. She's part of the backstory of David, and not many people know much about her. Most of us are familiar with King David. If you grew up in church, you would certainly know that, David was, when he was a teenager, he faced Goliath in the valley of Elah, killed him with just a slingshot. Everybody knows that story. David then, of course, becomes a national hero, so gets to go live with the king, King Saul at the time, and in his household. And then gets to head up Saul's army. And they write songs about David. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. But as time goes by, this begins to make Saul jealous. And more than that, Saul later gets word that the prophet Samuel had earlier gone to David's house and anointed him as the next king of Israel. And if you're the current king, that is a problem, because you want your son to be the next king. So now David is a threat to Saul's dynasty. So Saul tries to kill David, and David becomes a fugitive. So David flees from Saul, and he gathers other fugitives around him. And before long, the text says that David has about 600 men, plus their wives and their families with him. So now David has his own small army. And this story takes place in this season of his life, when he is fugitive David. And this is where we meet Abigail. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 25, if you'd like to follow along. A certain man in Moab who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. So shearing season was like the harvest season. This is like payday. All right, this is a good day in their lives. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman. This is familiar with in many cases. But her husband was harsh and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. So the text is clear about the kind of person Nabal was, harsh and mean. The story continues. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name." So when you show up, greet him in my name, so everybody would know you're coming from me, because everybody knew David was this national hero. Say to him, "Long life to you, Nabal. Good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. I mean, this was a formal ancient greeting which basically said, I come in peace. And then make sure you give him the message, and here is the message. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time, and when your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs went missing. In other words, while your flocks were near us, night after night after night, during that whole season, our men were near. We never took anything. In fact, our presence stopped anyone else taking anything that was yours. And don't just take my word for it. Ask your servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable towards my men. Since we come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. In other words, it's harvest time, it's shearing time. You're going to have extra. We kind of help to create some of that extra. If you would share some of that with us, that would be great. So when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name, and then they waited. And they waited. And they waited. And they waited. Because Nabal was making them wait. Now, while they're waiting on Nabal, I just want to say a word about David. And this is the part left out in your children's church class about him when you grew up. When you read what the text says about David, David was a very violent man. He was not somebody to be trifled with. When he lived near the Philistines, he regularly raided Philistine villages. And this is what is written about him. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. So he was a dangerous and violent man. So Nabal knew the reputation of David. Well, after keeping David's men waiting, Nabal answered David's servant, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" He knew who David was. In fact, he says, many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. He's saying David is an outlaw who has broken away from his master. He's just another servant in rebellion. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? So no, I'm not going to share anything. So David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. Then David said to his men, "Each of you, strap on your sword." And so they did. Then an interesting detail in the text. David strapped on his as well. There's a reason the author highlights David arming himself with his sword as well. Remember, David's sword had come from Goliath. When he's first on the run from Saul, he retrieves Goliath's sword from a priest, Ahimelech, at a place called Nob. Now, Goliath's sword is a visual aid, a representation to David of God's promises and protection and provision. A reminder to David that God had chosen him. God had anointed him as a teenager, as king. He did not need to take matters into his own hands. But David has forgotten the story that goes with the sword because he is so angry with the way he's been treated. So now David is going to take revenge on Nabal for this insult. The text continues. About 400 men went up with David. 400 men. This is an overreaction of epic proportion. This was going to be a massacre of shepherds and so on. The writer also gives us the internal conversation David is having with himself, justifying his actions against Nabal. David says to himself, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." In other words, I'm going to kill him. And then I'm going to kill all his male servants. And then I'm going to kill all his sons. And that will teach him to treat me this way. Now, when it comes to our lives and circumstances, our natural reaction is to want to power up and to return evil for evil, because then we will feel better. But responding like the person who comes against us only makes us the same as them. To be like someone we would readily admit we dislike. Returning evil for evil or like for like, that just makes us even. Internally we know we don't want to be like this person who is coming against us. Getting even with someone never ends the cycle. In most cases, it just perpetuates it. So what approach should we take? Well, the story continues. Meanwhile, back in Carmel, one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yes, these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us. And the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us. In other words, they protected us. The whole time we were herding our sheep near them. The servant then says, now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. Even the servant has heard of David's exploits, and that he would not take this insult lying down. So Abigail acted quickly. She assembled a caravan of food donkeys. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. When she meets David on the way with his 400 men armed for battle, the text says, as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending towards her, and she met them. So David now encounters this beautiful woman with this caravan of food donkeys. This was not what he was expecting. I mean, he'd worked up a head of steam for a battle. Now we are told, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkeys and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. And this is so powerful because she begins to speak to David as if he is already the man she hopes he will become. She fell at his feet and said, pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He's just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. So she's saying, you're not wrong about my husband. I understand why you will be angry. I get it. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. In other words, if I had met them rather than my husband, this whole thing could have been avoided. And listen to what she says next, and this is so powerful. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands. She's saying, David, you're not the kind of person who would avenge yourself on a man like Nabal. You're not the kind of man who has to avenge himself on innocent servants and sons. And David, you don't have to avenge yourself with your own hands. Remember, God fights your battles. You are anointed by God. And then she says, and let this gift which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the men who follow you. Again, this completely ruins his plans. I mean, how do you justify slaughter and pillage when someone is bringing you what you were planning to take? And then Abigail gives him credit for being better than he was about to be. She continues, the Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord because you fight the Lord's battles. David, you fight the Lord's battles. You don't have to fight your own battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Really? She's saying, yeah. And then she refers to King Saul and that David is a fugitive. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, and then she uses Hebrew imagery here, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. Here's what she's saying. Even though someone is trying to take your life is secure, bundled together with those whom God protects. He's going to hold you. And then she takes him back to when he faced Goliath. And here is what she says. But the lives of your enemies, he, God, will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. She's reminding him, when you went down to face Goliath in the valley of Elah, you weren't a warrior. You weren't equipped for battle. You didn't have a sword. But you trusted God. And you did what you thought God wanted you to do. Remember how God delivered you? How God defended you? David, you don't need to get even. You have no need to return evil for evil. For the Lord your God is with you. And then she speaks to his future. And essentially, she asks David, what story do you want to tell when this is nothing but a story that you tell? Years from now, when you're looking back on this incident, one day when you are the king, and when you look back on this time, what story do you want to tell? She says, when the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler or king over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or for having avenged himself. David, isn't this the better story? Don't you want to look back on this time and realize that you stepped back from taking matters into your own hands? And David comes to his senses and realizes he was about to act like somebody he doesn't even like. David said to Abigail, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. Go home in peace. I've heard your words and granted your request. Now, a quick note here on how this story ends. Soon after this incident, Abigail's husband Nabal dies. David gets to hear about it, so he sends messengers to her to ask if she will become his wife. And she accepts. So a happily ever after kind of ending in the story. So, now, but how does this account interface with your life? Well, it's about how you respond when you face opposition. When you come up against someone, what will your story be? When your response to your current situation is nothing more than a story you tell, what story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell the story, I ended up like the person I dislike because I allowed them to infuriate me into acting just like them? That's not the story any of us want to tell. As Jesus followers, we are always called to ask, and even if we think it's too difficult to do, as Jesus follows, at least we should ask the question, what would it look like to return good for evil? Not to refuse to react in like kind, but to be kind. Not just to refuse to be bad, but to take seriously the words of Jesus of love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Very difficult to do. Very, very difficult to do. When Jesus says, pray for those who mistreat you, he's saying, I don't want you to do something to them. I want you to do something for them. Because that's how you keep from becoming like them. And more than that, Jesus knew that doing good to people who have not been good to us is ultimately what frees us and protects our hearts. It's difficult, and we may not be able to, but at least ask the question. We should ask the question, when we're facing opposition, what would it look like to return good for evil? To do for others what they precisely don't deserve for you to do. You know, wanting to get even is natural, but Jesus has invited us to something that is extraordinary, really. Not just natural, but by the power of his Spirit, he's saying, I'm wanting you to be supernatural. And your willingness to say yes, and your willingness to step into that space that so few people have the courage to step into, where you seek to do good in that moment for that person, in that moment what you're doing is you're modeling exactly the way your Heavenly Father deals with you. Let's leave it there. Let's stand. Let's pray.